Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, Editorial Consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. On November 5th, 2024, the US citizens will elect their next president. The election in USA has raised considerable excitement in India as well, and hence IGPP began an educational series to introduce the audience to the various facets of the election procedure. A host of eminent academics have helped us reflect on various issues that are important to American voters and understand the consequences of the voters' choice upon the larger world with particular focus on India, and highlight the role played by Indian and other diaspora communities in the US election. We continue to take a new issue each week, detail its historicity and contemporary problems through a graphic video, and engage with senior scholars who provide valuable insights and new perspectives. As the US presidential election approaches, misinformation and disinformation have become major concerns in political discussions. Misinformation is the dissemination of inaccurate or misleading information without malicious intent, whereas disinformation is intentionally deceptive content. Both have significantly impacted public opinion, swayed election results, and eroded trust in institutions. In US elections, misinformation has had a profound impact. In the 2000 presidential election, for example, controversies surrounding ballot design, voter disenfranchisement, and recount procedures contributed to confusion and distrust among the public. Similarly, during the 2016 election, disinformation campaigns targeted the electorate, spreading misleading narratives about candidates and issues, which led to widespread misinformation and raised questions about the legitimacy of the electoral process. These events illustrate how misinformation has been used strategically to create doubt and chaos, further complicated by the evolution of media. The role of the media has evolved over time in spreading misinformation. Initially, print media dominated as the main form of communication, while oral tradition and pamphlets also contributed. As technology advanced, radio and television took over, with sensationalism emerging as a key strategy to capture public attention. This contributed to the spread of misinformation, as exaggerated or misleading stories became common, especially during political campaigns. With the advent of internet and social media, the rapid dissemination of both accurate and false information has transformed the media landscape entirely, amplifying the speech and reach of misinformation. In today's digital age, social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram are essential in shaping public discourse. These platforms, however, are also breeding grounds for misinformation. Algorithms designed to increase user engagement often prioritize sensational or divisive content, which can amplify the spread of misinformation. Posts with misleading information are more likely to be shared and commented on, creating a snowball effect that reinforces false narratives. Social media companies are aware of this issue and have started implementing measures to combat the spread of misinformation. But challenges remain due to the vast amount of content generated daily. As the 2024 US presidential election draws closer, misinformation is expected to continue playing a pivotal role, much like in previous election cycles. False claims about voting procedures, candidates' backgrounds, and other election-related matters have circulated in the past and are likely to resurface. For example, misleading information about the legality or security of mail-in ballots was widespread during the 2020 election, and similar narratives may emerge again in 2024, despite mail-in voting being legal in all states with variations in procedures. Fabricated stories about candidates' qualifications may also be used to confuse voters and erode confidence in the electoral process. Such tactics can influence public opinion by creating divisions and distorting perceptions of reality. Studies show that repeated exposure to misinformation can affect voter behavior, as people tend to trust information that aligns with their pre-existing beliefs, a phenomenon known as confirmation bias. Social media companies and government authorities have made some attempts to counter misinformation. Platforms like Facebook and X have introduced fact-checking initiatives and other content moderation policies to flag or remove false content. Additionally, government entities are increasing their efforts to monitor election-related misinformation, though the scale of the problem makes it difficult to address it comprehensively. Nevertheless, these actions represent a positive step towards maintaining the integrity of information circulated online. The consequences of widespread misinformation are far-reaching. One of the most significant effects is the erosion of trust in institutions. When false information is repeatedly circulated, it creates doubt about the legitimacy of media outlets, government bodies, and even the electoral process itself. This distrust fosters skepticism and makes it difficult for individuals to differentiate between accurate and false information. Moreover, misinformation contributes to the polarization of political discourse, deepening divisions between opposing political groups. It fuels radicalization, as people are drawn to extreme ideologies that offer simple explanations for complex issues. Another consequence of misinformation is its threat to democracy. By undermining electoral integrity, false information can weaken public confidence in the democratic process. If large number of voters base their decisions on misinformation, the outcome of election could be skewed, potentially leading to unrepresentative leadership. Furthermore, misinformation can create confusion about the voting process itself, deterring people from participating in elections and leaving some voters disenfranchised. To combat misinformation, a multifaceted approach is essential, with education and collaboration at its core. Media literacy taught in schools, universities, and organizations is crucial for helping individuals critically evaluate the information they encounter and identify unreliable sources. Public awareness campaigns can further raise consciousness about the dangers of misinformation. Additionally, partnerships between tech companies, governments, and NGOs can foster comprehensive solutions by sharing resources and knowledge, working together to create a safer, more reliable information ecosystem. Technology can be instrumental in tackling misinformation. Recent advancements in artificial intelligence demonstrate potential in recognizing and reducing the dissemination of false information. AI algorithms can scan vast amount of content to detect patterns associated with misinformation, making it easier to flag problematic posts before they go viral. However, this approach must be combined with human oversight to ensure that AI does not infringe on free speech or make errors in content moderation. In 2024, misinformation and disinformation pose significant threats to the integrity of US election. Combating the spread of false information and protecting the democratic process require a concerted effort through education, technology, and collaboration. It is crucial for individuals to actively promote media literacy and hold those accountable who perpetuate misinformation. By fostering a more informed electorate and demanding accountability, the integrity of the electoral process can be safeguarded, ensuring that every voice is represented accurately. US presidential election this year was full of twists and turns that couldn't have been possibly anticipated. However, there was one epidemic that was anticipated by experts but could not be stopped, and it seems to have gotten even worse this time: the epidemic of misinformation and disinformation. This epidemic has cast a long shadow on democratic processes, and steps need to be taken to ensure that this does not divide the society any further. To discuss the varied impacts of misinformation and the role played by legacy media and new age digital media this election, we are joined by Professor Matthew A. Baum. Professor Matthew is the Marvin Kalb Professor of Global Communication and Professor of Public Policy at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government and Department of Government. His research focuses on the domestic politics of international conflict and cooperation in general, and American foreign policy in particular, as well as on the role of mass media and public opinion in contemporary American politics. He is also the co founder, principal investigator, and co editor of the Harvard Kennedy School Misinformation Review, and co founder and principal investigator of the COVID States Project. He has co-authored books, namely Soft News Goes to War, Public Opinion, and American Foreign Policy in the New Media Age. War Stories, The Causes and Consequences of Public Views on War, and War and Democratic Constraint, How the Public Influences Foreign Policy. He has contributed op-ed articles to a variety of newspapers, magazines, and blog sites in the United States and abroad. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talk, sir.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we have heard this allegation by Donald Trump time and again, both during his first presidency and during the recent debates, that the media houses are biased against him. And while that may be an exaggeration, but do you believe that media houses have certainly become partisans and more than common public? And there's a media house that would support a particular candidate and others that would support other.
Well, it's certainly the case that we have influential partisan media in the United States. There's no question about that. But that's a different point than arguing that all of the mainstream media are partisan. And I think that latter point is not really correct. We still have a pretty robust traditional or mainstream media marketplace in the United States, where traditional news values still hold sway. You could think of newspapers and television networks and public radio. There are any number of such outlets across the country. That doesn't mean that they're perfectly neutral or perfectly unbiased in every conceivable way. It just means that they aren't rooting for one or the other party editorially, or I guess I should say in their news coverage. Editorially is kind of a different matter. I sort of misspoke. So I think it depends on what you're talking about when you talk about the media.
There has been an increase in the use of new age digital media like social media platforms or podcasts and such. And there's another phenomena that is quite unique to US is that of celebrity endorsements. And but what has been unique this time that a head of a tech company has gone out in a campaign in support of a certain candidate. Is that all right, or should there be a fine line between an individual expressing his own opinion and head of a social media platforms with millions of followers nudging his followers in a certain direction through false information?
So I'm assuming you're talking about Elon Musk and X. Um, and, frankly, in the United States today, there's nothing illegal about anything that he's doing. He owns X and he can do whatever he wants with it, as long as he doesn't violate any laws. And he can certainly advocate in favor of any political candidate he wants to. Whether we think that's a normatively good thing, is a very different question. He's somebody with a lot of economic and political power, and a huge megaphone. And so you could argue, I suppose, that at some level, if we were to make a public policy choice in this country, that social media platforms ought to be treated like media rather than like private businesses that are, protected by the First Amendment in a way that broadcasters that are licensed by the federal government are subject to restrictions. If we were to change that mix, we might conclude that, whatever you might think as the owner, you can't use your, and I would put this in air quotes, network as a vehicle for expressing your personal opinions in the way that Musk is doing. But we haven't made that choice, at least not yet. As of today, social media platforms are not treated like media enterprises. And so whatever you might personally think about it, whether it's a great thing or corrupt and just normatively a bad thing, he's not violating any laws in doing it. And so for the time being, at least, he's free to do it.
I know that there was recent controversy about some leaders saying that because of the First Amendment rights, there has been a wide spread epidemic of misinformation, and maybe we should like sort of put some stop to it. There has also been case where political leaders have gone out and have made absurdly false claims, and how do you stop that? Because as a user, not everybody would know what is true and false, and you would take the take what the leader is saying probably to be true. So how do you draw that fine line, and should we draw a fine line there? And also today it's Twitter, but tomorrow it may be some another tech giant who is tweaking algorithm and ensuring that we are deliberately misinformed.
Yeah, it's another really tough question, and it's fundamentally a question of public policy choice. So the United States has tended to fall on the side of allowing more speech, much more than the side of protecting consumers against potentially harmful speech. It's not that there are no restrictions, but they are relatively limited. And in the current period, with the courts, especially the Supreme Court that we have pretty narrow, they've interpreted pretty narrowly the public right to be protected from questionable information, especially online. So it's not easy in the current environment to intervene against that. Now, the platforms, as private actors, are free to sort of try different steps to mitigate the flow of misinformation on their platforms. But they face a lot of blowback when they do. And in fact, they're, if anything, intervening against misinformation less than they have in the past. So, which, certainly doesn't help the problem. So, you can think about steps that we theoretically could take both on the demand and on the supply side. So on the demand side, there are all sorts of potential interventions that can help users navigate the information environment, help them to better determine what is reliable and what is not. Most of the research into what is effective is fairly preliminary and has been mostly tested in laboratory settings, not so much in the real world. For instance, there's been a lot of investment in fact checking, but studies show that basically the primary users of fact checks are folks who are sympathetic to the endeavor to correct that information, which tends to be more one side than the other side. And the side whose facts are being checked tends to impeach the validity or the reliability of the source, to accuse them of being biased. So it doesn't really change that many minds. That doesn't mean it has no effect, but it limits its ability to have effect. So these supply side interventions, demand side interventions, if there are any number of things that we can do that can make people a little bit better as consumers of information, I doubt there's any silver bullet there, that there's any sort of magic intervention that's going to cause people to stop accepting and sharing misinformation. Part of the reason is that there are lots of reasons people share misinformation or consume it. Not all of them have to do or assume that they believe that it's necessarily true or care whether or not it's true. Sometimes it's just signaling the team you're on, or a broader attitude, and the details are less important. So whether or not this particular story is true may not matter that much in those circumstances. On the other hand, on the supply side, again, we're back in the realm of public policy. There have been several studies, one of which several of my colleagues participated in, that have shown that in a number of different contexts, vaccine misinformation, and COVID vaccine misinformation, anti-vax misinformation more generally, the number of sources of misinformation are extremely small. So I can't quite quote the numbers, but I think it was something like over half of all vaccine-related misinformation originated with 0.002% of Twitter users, a few hundred of them. That's an enormous percentage. So that suggests you could intervene by going to the source and cutting off the prolific producers and sharers of misinformation. We saw a similar sort of thing in the aftermath of January 6th. 24 hours later, when Twitter banned Donald Trump's Twitter account, there was apparently a roughly 70% decline in all political misinformation almost overnight from one source. So this suggests the means are there to make a difference, but there has to be a public will to make policy in that regard. And it, of course, has to pass constitutional muster with the courts in an environment where the courts seem not to be in the mood to facilitate more restrictions on First Amendment rights to say whatever you want.
I have this one question that I have repeatedly asked during the series, but I've got no clear answer till yet. There's one group of political commentators who would say that the American society isn't as divided as it might seem on social media or in the news. But there's another group of political commentators who would say that, the divides are really deep and they really need to be worked upon. The fractures need to be healed. And a lot of those divides are driven by misinformation. Do you think that this epidemic of misinformation and disinformation does have ramifications on ground? Like there have been cults such as QAnon, which has formed people's political opinion. We have seen that the violent attack on January 6th. Do you think that this election particularly, even if misinformation and disinformation does not play a role electorally, do you think they might have the potential to deepen the already existing divides in the American society? And how is the American society really divided because of misinformation and disinformation?
So there are several questions embedded in that question, that overarching question, and I think it would be sort of, I guess I have several answers. I think there's one question is, how important a role does misinformation play in the problem of polarization? And that is really an open question. Because as I said a moment ago, we certainly know that at least under some circumstances, people read, share, like misinformation more as an expression of their attitudes, rather than having that misinformation influence their attitudes and cause them to believe the way they do. So you have to kind of think about separating out cause from effects in trying to answer that question, and that's kind of hard to do. It's also the case that you have to distinguish between when you talk about divides, are we talking about on sort of public life and public policy, or are we talking about, in other words, do Americans disagree profoundly on policy issues, or more so in the context of what's called affective polarization? In other words, just not liking the other side. And then either way, where does that come from? Why? Is it misinformation, or is it something else? And I think it is certainly the case that there is more polarization on policy than there used to be, but it is not nearly as dramatic as affective polarization. Just, I don't like, if I'm a Democrat, I don't like Republicans. If I'm a Republican, I don't like Democrats. And then if you push me and ask me why, I can come up with some reasons, but those reasons may not really be true. They are sort of post hoc rationalizations for this attitude I know I have, and you're forcing me to sort of, give you some reasons. So I'll talk about public policies, but those aren't necessarily the basis for it. For instance, we know that people adopt policies so that they can be consistent with their party, rather than choosing their parties so that it will be consistent with their policies, or at least more so. We know that also from research. So again, it's complicated. I think a lot of the polarization comes from sort of a top-down situation where elites have always been more polarized than the general public, and even more so today. And elites are then sending signals down to their partisans on their team, reasons why they ought not like the other side. And so that over time kind of filters down and increases the divide at the mass public level, even though the origin is at the elite level. Now, some of that, of course, is misinformation. Think about the Trump accusation about Haitians in Springfield eating cats and dogs. Ridiculous assertion, but harped on it for days. You started seeing increasing reference to this online among Republicans. Soon thereafter, you started having violent threats coming into Springfield, to the point where the governor had elementary school children being escorted by state police to school because of threats. So this was clearly a top-down distribution of the story. Now, in fairness, rather in contrast, I guess I should caveat that by saying that it really was just one person who, and I can't remember the woman's name, who originally shared this story. And so it started kind of arguably as a bottom-up story, but it really wasn't until the president said it on national TV that it started, that this reverberation took place to the point where you started having threats of violence against people in Springfield.
One of the points that also came up, that the major divide today in American society is between those who have been to college-going citizens, and those who haven't, and those who were able to reap the benefits of prosperity that America has enjoyed, and those who haven't. So yes, and then misinformation seems to add to their perception of what is wrong with the other party or the other side. Recently, the two presidential candidates have also been doing rounds of digital podcasts to get their message across to the young audience. How do you view the role of TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter in campaign strategies? And do you think that they have what it takes to set a serious political discourse, because we also know that they also tend to limit the attention span.
Yeah, there is no question that these social media apps, especially TikTok, are playing an outsized role in 2024. We've seen sort of a steady increase of the role of social media more broadly. And I guess 2024 is really the year that politics has gone mainstream on TikTok in particular. It's important. There's an important constituency that both sides are trying to reach, younger voters who, a lot of whom get their information about the world, including politics, from these apps, whether it's Instagram or TikTok or whatever. So it's important that major political campaigns have a presence there. Whether or not they do it well is a different question. I remember Joe Biden, before he dropped out, came under a lot of criticism for seeming, I think there were a series of stories calling him creepy on TikTok for one of his ads that he put on TikTok. So being skilled at, doing it and being skilled at it are two different things. It's unclear how much effect it will have. There's reason to believe that it would matter, but since we haven't really been through this yet, we don't really know how much. We'll have a better idea in a couple of years after, when we can look retrospectively at, trying to assess the effects on turnout in particular, which I think is where the two sides are working the hardest, trying to get their younger voters to turn out for them. They're sort of younger voters that would be inclined to support them if they vote. Because it's always hardest, at least in American politics, to get younger folks to turn out. You can sort of identify who's sympathetic to your side, but then getting them to show up and vote is a whole different enterprise. And so I think this is a big investment in getting out the vote.
There's one specific instance of where there was some sort of momentum on social media, TikTok, and other platforms, but it did not really translate into something effective, or you tell us if it was effective, as it also aligns with your research area, that is domestic politics of international conflict and American foreign policy. And we saw that from Hollywood to college campuses, there was a lot of support for the cause of Palestinians and the call for ceasefire. And it was enabled primarily through the use of these new age digital media. Can public perception of foreign policy issues really have an impact on policy making by government? And why has it not been effective this time? Or if I'm wrong, has it been effective this time?
So again, another really big question and a very specific case. So maybe I should start with the case before well, all right. And my big answer to the big question, can public opinion matter, is clearly yes, because at the end of the day, in a democracy, if you anger too many voters, they can get rid of you. So clearly, yes. That doesn't mean that it necessarily will in every circumstance. It is still the case that there is especially in more so in American politics than in many countries with different constitutional structures, politicians are somewhat insulated from mass public opinion. We have fixed term intermittent elections. So if you are a president and you do something really unpopular in foreign policy in year 1 or year 2, you have a lot of time for people to forget about it and move on. Think about the withdrawal from Afghanistan by President Biden. Probably not a coincidence that took place in his first year. Lots of time for the public to forget about it. And the Republicans have tried to revive that as an issue, and they tried, especially when Biden was still in the campaign, but it really didn't have teeth anymore because the public just really wasn't focused on it. On the other hand, there are definitely circumstances under which you can see evidence of public opinion playing a role, where sometimes it's proactive, where a leader is anticipating how the public is going to respond and might be more hesitant to take action. I'm thinking of President Obama's hesitant to take military action against President Assad to Syria, even after he used chemical weapons, for instance. President Obama drew his famous or infamous red line and then backed away from it. Well, why did he back away from it? Well, one contributing factor is probably that there was very little support in the public or in the Congress for doing it. And the concern was that this was going to undermine his political position at home if he took that action abroad. So it's one thing to say, yes, public opinion can influence the decision making of democratic leaders. And there are a variety of factors that account for the circumstances under which that's more or less likely. It's another thing to talk about a specific instance, and you mentioned the Gaza war and American policy towards Israel. And I think there are a number of factors that have gone into play here. Firstly, Israel has a lot of support in Congress. And that's just, that may change one day, but as of today, a large majority of Congress people and senators are staunch supporters of Israel across party lines. It's more divided in the Democratic side, but still, there's a lot of support for Israel. It would take a lot to break that. So that's one thing. A second thing is that the U.S. has had very, very, very long-standing close ties with Israel since the 1950s. And again, a very difficult position to fundamentally alter. Whether or not you agree that it's in the U.S. national security interest to be really close to Israel, and obviously Americans debate about that, the reality remains that the U.S. and Israel have had very strong ties for a very long time. So that is thing two. Thing three is we saw a lot of protests, especially on college campuses and especially on elite Northeastern college campuses last year. But when you look at national polls, the Gaza war doesn't register anywhere nearly as salient as it did in this very small constituency. So in Gallup polls, it's not unusual to see 1% of Americans rating it as the most important problem. An issue that's at 1% is not going amongst the public is not going to drive policy in any serious way. It frees up the politicians to basically ignore the really loud minority. Now, so to some extent, I think that's what's going on, is that, the media and the fact that this is coming from elite institutions greatly magnified the voice of the protesters. So it was a lot of sound and fury, but then national polls showed that most Americans were just sort of not focused on it. They were much more concerned with other stuff like the economy, inflation, immigration, whatever, but not that. So there was that that's a major factor that constrains the influence of the protesters on policy. The one important caveat there is, we're in a world of extremely small margins in a few places being potentially critical. And it is the case that there are a lot of Arab American voters in several districts in Michigan, which is a state that the Democrats really, really, really want to win, who feel really, really strongly on this issue. And this is a really difficult nut to crack for the Harris campaign. They're trying to walk this fine line, because if she were to take a position that was especially, advocating maybe, breaking relations with Israel or cutting off military aid or something like that, she would alienate a whole swath of the Democratic Party. She wouldn't gain very many votes nationally, because most progressives can read the tea leaves, which is, I may not love Harris, but Trump is sort of antithetical to everything I believe in. So even if I'm angry about this, I'm probably not going to vote for Harris. But there is this small, relatively small, but concentrated group of folks for whom this is maybe the most important issue. And that's a tough one to navigate. And, it is not inconceivable that it could cost her Michigan. So in that sense, you could say, here's a case where a relatively small niche of American public opinion can potentially have outsized influence. I guarantee you the Harris campaign is spending a lot of attention on the Arab American community in Michigan. I guarantee you they are. So this, whether or not it's going to fundamentally change her policy, it's going to capture an awful lot of her attention. She's going to devote a lot of energy to trying to figure out how to move her positions toward them enough that she can get them to turn out and vote for her rather than Jill Stein, for instance.
Uh, to my last question, you're also the co-founder, principal investigator, and co-editor of Harvard Kennedy School Misinformation Review, and I believe that plays a role in telling about misinformation and maybe finding ways to curb it. In an era where it may be difficult for a layperson to distinguish between what is true and what is false, and all news tends to get sensationalized, how do we ensure that the focus of citizens remain where it's important? And how do we make this distinction between what is true and what is false? Should journalists or scholars, news channels, tech giants, should they take up this challenge? Can they even take up this challenge? This is also particularly personal because I have been reading about American elections from social media a lot, and I'm left to wonder whether they can really control the weather or not. I mean, US can do a lot of things.
Yeah, it's funny, but it's really not funny that a number of people took that seriously. It's kind of frightening that a number of people took it seriously. Although, frankly, again, excuse me, I think this is, for some people at least, more a case of I fundamentally hate the government and I see this story and it gives me another reason to hate the government. So if I'm like, a militia member looking where I'm going to go deploy, this gave me, I'll go after FEMA people. There's nothing funny about that. It's kind of scary actually, and it's interfering with FEMA's emergency response. So it's deadly serious. But anyway, the bigger picture question, it's really hard. As I said, there's a lot of folks that are doing research into what can we do, we as a society, as journalists, as news organizations, as social media platforms, what can we do to stem the flow? And again, there is no magic bullet. The misinformation problem is varied. There are a lot of different reasons people spread misinformation. Most of it is about making money, selling vitamin supplements and things like that. But a fair amount of it is also pernicious and about social issues, and occasionally it can lead to really bad outcomes, really kind of scary, dangerous things. We've all heard anecdotes. I think the unfortunate truth is, again, to reiterate, there's not a magic bullet here. Certainly not in terms of education and information. I think civics education is important because it helps people be better consumers. I think media organizations are right to emphasize things like fact checking and verifying the reliability of information. These are all incredibly important. I think, the social media environment is almost a free-for-all right now. Hopefully, my personal hope is that that will change, that we will put some guardrails in place with legal teeth rather than just voluntary steps taken by the organizations themselves. Individual journalists, they can make a difference. Again, it's lots of little steps, especially if we're talking about the demand side, which is what we're really talking about here. Trying to get people to not consume it, not believe it, not share it, that sort of thing, especially harmful misinformation. So a very large number of small steps, getting people to cross-check information that matters to them, check more than one source is one thing. Getting people to process the importance of reliability before they start consuming news. So, inducing them to think in those terms. There are steps you can take there, sometimes very simple ones. A very small amount of cognitive reflection can greatly improve people's ability to distinguish between true and false information. So there are lots of little things. If you line them up, there's at least the potential to make a significant difference. But I think there's no way in which we fundamentally, thwart this problem purely from the demand side. We have to also have interventions aimed at the supply of misinformation, at the sources. That again, it's hard in a place like the United States with the First Amendment, and depending on the interpretation of the First Amendment by the courts, it makes it really challenging. But if we really want to address this, eventually we're going to have to find a balance there.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and this was such a lively and interesting